everybody for joining the TrustedSec webinar on PCI forward-dated controls. And as you see, these requirements are not actually required. And not that PCI isn't the most interesting topic, but even as excited we are and how much we get at the topic like this, we're amazed at the response. So it's been a tremendous response for this webinar. Obviously, a lot of interest and a lot of really knowing what to do and what not to do. My name is Stephen Marshowitz. I'm the head of risk management here at TrustedSec. TrustedSec, if you're not familiar with us, we are a full-service consulting firm. And really, you know, some of the differences between us is when you become a customer, we really see you as a partner for life. We always want to be there to help you, go over and bend over backwards to make sure we're doing the right thing on your behalf. We've been in business for about 6 years now. Obviously, regularly speak at conferences. We're on the news. Founder has and several people here founded DerbyCon. So we have a lot of interest from there. And really what we're seeing, you know, this cutting edge and how we look to do the right things right is, you know, some of the things that are changing in the industry that's, I think, fascinating and how we bring the two sides together from advisory to technical is, you know, it used to be just a couple years ago where most anybody could do a pen test. Now it's gotten to the point where it's much harder to do. And you have to have the leading edge teams and resources on your behalf. Because if you don't, you would, in essence, get a passing grade and think you're doing fine. So what we've seen is pen testing really could even increase your risk because you have a false sense of security of what you're able to do and how secure you are. For example, we just brought on Carlos Perez, also known as Dark Operator, who is one of the contributors to Metasploit. So not only have we have a contributor, we've also helped write the user guide, Dave Kennedy, on that as well. So really bringing that cutting edge team together for you. Our services, we have really pride ourselves on working together between technical and advisory. Obviously, you can look at the services, but a couple things I'll point out, things that have really picked up in addition to PCI here. But our purple team assessments with adversarial detection and countermeasures, bringing that red team, the offensive, and blue team together along with your incident response. We've really seen a tremendous amount of value over that. And then when we look at our business risk assessments, one of the unique things that TrustedSec brings to you is that we're bringing in our adversarial attack simulation. So we're actually using the results of those cutting edge research and pen testers that we have on board to help reduce your risk and really understand better what's really happening, both from a strategic perspective, but also tactical. What do I need specifically to do to remedy any issues that I have? How do I speak to our executives so that we can build budget, et cetera? So it's something that we're proud of and how we're going to market. And I'm also very excited to introduce Justin Leapline. And I'll let him talk a little bit about himself, but we've known each other for quite a while, and you know, he's one of these guys that eats, sleeps, and breathes it, which pen testing might be a little easier than PCI. Not everybody does that. So Justin,
I say if you get locked in a book with one book to read, you tend to get pretty good at that book, you know, and everything. Which they lock me in a room to read PCI, and that's it. But yeah, Justin Leapline here. I lead the PCI practice here at TrustedSec. Have a broad range of experience in around the financial sector, a lot of it dealing with PCI. This is my second go around being a QSA. I've been on the acquiring side, the issuing side, e-commerce, service provider, also, you know, at a large financial support company. We did a lot of PCI DSS certifications as well as PTS devices for electronic pin pads, and even the last job, even before coming over to TrustedSec, I did a lot with card production, where you're actually issuing out brands with cards on it. So really interesting seeing the other side of that from the issuing side. But today we're going to be talking about obviously PCI, but some of the specific requirements that came out version 3.2 that got released April 2016. Hopefully this isn't the first time that anybody's kind of hearing this. It's almost 2 years in the works that there's been a lot of, you know, forward reporting, and this isn't a new topic. People have been talking about it for a while, but we're going to be talking about specifically those 9 forward-dated controls from a PCI stance, what the actual interpretation means with that, what we're looking for from a QSA perspective as evidence for that, and then just general thoughts and comments on, kind of the future of these controls and everything. Feel free to send in your questions as we're submitting, and we're going to have a little bit of time at the end to actually address those. So real quick, we're not going to spend a lot of time with it, but PCI is 6 main areas, 12 main requirements, came out of a combination of the card brands. They each had their own standard back in 2004 time, and they got together and actually combined all those standards, mainly coming from Visa and MasterCard. But they combined them all, and that's where we got the kind of PCI DSS 1.0. And it's involved over the years and everything in scope, and as well as affecting merchants and service providers. It just got more regulated from the card brands and more impactful with it. So an important distinction that we are going to be talking about, a number of these controls that we're referencing are only for service providers. So I just want to talk briefly on that. If you have a merchant account and you're accepting payments into your own account through an acquiring bank or merchant bank, you are a merchant. If you're a service provider, you're helping those merchants either, by them outsourcing some of the services to you. The common example would be kind of a web hosting solution like an AWS or a Google Cloud type of provider where you kind of control the infrastructure, or it could be as simple as you doing monitoring for log monitoring to help them with requirement 10. Within PCI. So there's a number of different things that would fall under the service provider, but important distinction as a number of these only affect service providers with that. So let's dive right into the controls here. First one, and we're going to go in numerical order as we're going through here. So first one is actually in requirement 351. Specifically, it's calling out more details in and around your cryptographic architecture. So it's asking for details on protocols, key uses, key expiration. So when we're coming into an environment, we're specifically looking for that to be documented some way, shape, or form. Usually it's going to be in some type of key management or cryptographic architecture type document. A couple of important things to kind of bring out. So that's pretty simple. One of the things that's kind of interesting is that they call out protocols in here. And as PCI has actually designed this, requirement 3 is about data at rest. That's the core point to this, but they specifically call out protocols here. And we've kind of kicked around in the TrustedSec arena here and looked at this, but from our interpretation, unfortunately, it also is calling out if you're using cryptographic transmission, so TLS, things of that nature, that also has to be included into your document. It's unfortunate, like I said, that they're now combining the two. It'd be a better fit within requirement 4, but out of this requirement, it is asking for protocols to be documented as well. Next one, 646. This is a relatively straightforward one. One of the things that you have is if there's a significant change within the environment, PCI is now basically requiring that you go back and look at some of your documentation. So is your cardholder data flow diagrams updated? Do your network documents need updated? Is there policy documents that need updated if you're making a significant change within the environment? Keep in mind, one of the first things I recommend to entities dealing with this is that you define what significant change means to you. And it's important because you don't want to leave it up to the QSA to define that, because there could be different varying reasons that would come down to it. A good example is PCI has some legacy verbiage in there that says if you stand up a new web server, that could be a significant change. And while it could, a lot of the times that just might be scaling from an environment. So if you're spinning up another web server that's directly mirrored to another one, to me, at least from my point of view, that's not a significant change, but it shouldn't be up to me. It should be up to your change management policy. So what do you define as a significant change? And if you tell the QSA, here's how we define it, and here's what triggers on that, it would be hard for me to argue against that from an entity standpoint. So define that, and then, put in an update task within your change management that if the trigger happens that it is a significant change to the environment, that you then go back and review this and make sure that's documented well. Another thing, just keep in mind, if you do trigger on a significant change, there are other requirements within PCI, including a penetration test, a risk assessment, a vulnerability scan, are all triggers on significant changes with the environment. So if you define that as significant change, we would expect that to also be produced in that there. Next one here, and this is probably the one that gets the most commotion out of this, and this one affects both merchants and service providers. And this was a new one that they basically put down that any administrator access within the CDD must have two-factor access, even if you're coming from an internal network with this. So obviously, this is wide impacting, but a couple of things that we want to just point out that if you're dealing with your QSA, you want to make sure that you're holding their feet to the fire when interpreting this correctly. So first thing that comes out of this is there's a couple of qualifying things out of the requirement. It's non-console access, which would be, any type of virtualized access onto those systems. That does not mean if you're, right in front of the computer, have keyboard monitor to that, that does not count for two-factor access with this. If you're doing a KVM switch, that doesn't count. Now, if you're using a virtualized KVM switch, that would count as non-console access, with that there, if that makes sense to people. And then the other two qualifying things is CDE, cardholder data environment, and administrative access. So there's a lot of different things. So first, let's dive into CDE. PCI standard version 3.2 on page 10 says the CDE is comprised people, process, and technologies that store, process, or transmit cardholder data or sensitive authentication data. So that means that CDE is only systems that touch cardholder data. And there has been some confusion spot that PCI released December 2016, I think it was, that they released a segmentation scoping guidance document, which actually, if you dive into that documentation there, they actually redefined what CDE was, where to the point that it was any system that touched cardholder data or any system that was in the same network as that, which separates from the actual core definition. The good part about at least the guidance document is that at the bottom of every single page, they have a disclaimer that basically says they're not going to override or supersede what the PCI standard actually is. So from us at TrustedSec, we have defined this as CDE is still systems that touch cardholder data. Now, that doesn't mean that the systems that are in the same network without adequate network segmentation are not also included in the PCI scope. They're supportive components that are absolutely in scope. But for this control right here, you do not have to have two-factor authentication into it. Second thing with this is administrative access. So administrative access is defined by PCI in both their FAQ 1454, which is on their website, and also their PCI glossary, as elevate or increase privileges in order for the account to manage systems, networks, or applications. So we commonly say here at TrustedSec, if you can modify or degrade the security of the system itself, that would be administrative access that we would care about with that. So looking at that, if you're a pure user on a system that handles cardholder data, like a customer support agent or something like that, but don't have any administrative access to that system, you do not have to have two-factor access. But it's important to make sure that that they don't have administrative access. So if they have admin rights on their local laptops or desktops, that would count as administrative access. If they have administrative rights over an application that handles cardholder data that they could use to modify the security settings of that, that would count as admin access. So watch out when you're dealing with especially large user populations that you have specific roles detailed out and narrowed down to exactly with two-factor access on what would be required for two-factor access. So there's a lot of different solutions out there. Most of the stuff from what we're seeing from a QSA standpoint to date is administrative checkpoint or choke points, so jump boxes where they enforce all administration over certain cardholder data environments, actually go through a series of jump boxes for that. Other solutions that's more scattered would be integrated two-factor access on all on all the CDE. So that's integrating, if you're doing like Linux systems through SSH, integrating through the pluggable authentication module, PAM, or doing RSA, integrating the two-factor access through their Gina login prompt or something along that lines. We do have a client or two actually kind of doing the all-encompassing. They deal with a lot of cardholder data, and it was hard for them to specifically narrow it down to specific users for this. So they're actually enforcing a two-factor access across all their organization. That would work as well. Just keep in mind any exceptions to that process. So if you have vendors coming in that wouldn't have two-factor access that might provide administrative access on some of the CDE components, that's where that control would fail. And if the QSA caught that, they would, have to be remediated in that point there. Okay. Next one, service provider only. So this is one that a lot of people are struggling with from a gray area perspective. They list a lot of different things on detecting critical failures within security control systems. So if your IDS IPS stops working, how do you detect, what that is? If your FIM stops working, and it's that timely detection. So timely detection is obviously a big gray area between QSAs, what constitutes a timely detection, and also what constitutes that the control actually would fail, with that. Could have just failed closed, and you don't need detection with that. Some of the things that we're recommending and seeing in the industry with this is obviously network monitoring tools for appliances. So seeing if they're up, seeing if they're responding, that would be a good way to do that. So Nagios, Zabbix, are good open source tools. Host monitoring, OS Query, a lot of clients of ours seem to like that. And then automation tools like Puppet and Ansible. We have one client that has used Puppet to not only enforce their baselines on CIS, but to also reinforce that every day. So monitoring that and making sure that, their status boards are, all good, that the baselines is applied across the entire organization, which includes detecting if FIM is up and running and generating. Other tools might actually already include alerting into that. So if you have firewalls that might have their self-alerting and you're putting it off into a SIM, which you should be alerting on those alerts of, degraded security or, problems with the device or something along that lines, and get that escalated with it. AV products are common with that too. So if desktops aren't being scanned for a certain amount of time, then you can get alerts from there on certain days if they haven't been scanned for, 7 days or something along that lines. And then lastly, this you can also implement this through a manual process. So with FIM is a good example. You should be checking that, weekly on some of the changes with that, or automate it somehow. If in your process of checking it weekly, you don't see some systems actually working or missing some systems, that would be a timely detection, in my opinion, of raising that up to that. So don't dismiss having a manual process for checking that. And so going straight into, if there was a failure, there's a number of things that off of that failure, you need to also record with this. So it's if that failure of the security control in a timely process, if that happens and that triggers, you need to record a number of different things. And the bullet points are right here. So once you put that process in, make sure you're recording this. I typically recommend that you develop a specific IR procedure or playbook, to this, so that you can incorporate some of these core bullet points, and you're recording it into either your change control ticketing system or your IR system, something along that line, so that when things happen, you have all this recorded information. Specific things are start time, end time of when the actual control failed with this, identifying root causes, performing a risk assessment, identifying any security issues around the failure, and then resuming, obviously, the security control to get it back to normal. So all these information as a QSA, if an incident actually happened in the last given year, we'd look for this information through that evidence there. Another requirement that a lot of service providers were pushing back a little bit on this, but there's a little bit of light on this, is that penetration testing requirements actually upped to not only annually, but every 6 months for segmentation controls. Keep in mind, the way this control is actually written is if you're using segmentation controls to carve out different networks outside of the PCI zone. What we've been recommending to clients, say you're in a hosting environment and you have a 2-tiered hosting environment where you have kind of your application tier, your web application tier, and your backend database tier, and both of those zones are actually in scope. You're not employing segmentation controls as far as PCI is concerned, because those are actually requirements coming out of requirement 1 that are just directly required. You're not really carving off systems, or networks that are not applicable in the PCI realm. Now, if you have that same environment into your corporate environment, and you have your corporate zone, your desktop zone, your VoIP area that are not considered part of that, that's where you are employing segmentation controls, and then this would actually be a requirement to do this every 6 months. So important distinction from the point of PCI, whether you're using segmentation controls to limit your PCI environment with that. So where it might actually be a pointed thing is I have some customers that have a relatively small, e-commerce environment, and we're talking about, 10, 15, 20 systems. And if they carve off 3 systems and have to do a PCI pen test, twice a year, or if they just include those 3 systems into their scope, and, put it onto the network, then, then they might not have to do PCI pen tests, twice a year with that. So important thing to kind of note to that. Also, too, I will also want to bring up that it talks about every 6 months and after any segmentation controls or methods. This does not mean that if your ACL changes, that you need to do another pen test, with this. This is if you're actually switching, firewalls or ACL methods, if you're pushing it down to the endpoint rather than, network components there. This is actually changing the methods of the segmentation controls. So just keep that in mind. It doesn't mean if you're modifying ACLs, that's actually governed under requirement 1.1.1 with that. Another requirement for service providers only, and if you can pick up on a little trend, they're getting more into business as usual, as they like to define it, but putting more of a governance structure and not just a control environment in or around PCI. So with 12.4.1, they basically require that service providers come down with the PCI DSS compliance program. So in this, we're looking for a document that defines overall accountability for maintaining PCI DSS and defines a charter for communication to executive management. These can be really short. I mean, I've seen 1-2 page documents that have satisfied this. I mean, we're looking for 2 bullet points to kind of satisfy with this. If you already have a governance board, it'd just be good to put PCI DSS specifically into there if it's not already into there, and we could utilize that into the definition. Also, too, there's no, you have to do communication to executive management, but PCI doesn't define how often. If it's a QSA here, there would be, if it did it once a year, that could pass the control here. We look at the control and whether it's mean up to control. What we've been advising clients is you should probably do at least a quarterly update to it. And we're actually going to relate it back to a 12.11 when we're talking about some of the other requirements that they're doing. It's a perfect kind of segue into that with it. So, but generally speaking, you kind of want to update quarterly, but if it's annually, that wouldn't go against this control intention with it. So going on to 12.11 here, again, as a business as usual governance over this, one of the things that they're requiring is quarterly that somebody confirm that the controls that are in PCI, that somebody's going through and making sure that they're actually being done. So going through and seeing if somebody's doing daily log reviews or that the automated log alerting is still being done, firewall rule set reviews, applying configuration standards to systems, responding to security alerts, and the change management process are still being effectively done. Taking this, And we're going to talk about the next one that you have to do further documentation, but this is a perfect kind of check and then alerting out to executive management that everything is running effectively under the PCI DSS compliance program. Also too, I just point out that ideally this should be assigned to a governance or an internal audit function, as they would kind of be just overseeing some of the operational stuff. For smaller environments, you can get people that aren't really performing the activities, but like I said, ideally it should be into a governance role with them. And then finally, on those quarterly reviews, there needs to be a document results of the review and a sign-off on the personnel assigned to the PCI DSS compliance program. So there should be some formal assignment. It could either be paper form or digital form. If you have it in like a change ticket and somebody has to physically approve, that to actually be closed, or you have somebody's name recorded as closing that ticket as a kind of an evidence of somebody reviewing that. Recommend that this person and or team is the person in charge within the PCI DSS charter. So that would just be who's ever responsible for this would need to review the evidence that the checks were done and then sign off on it. One last thing that, and I just love that, it's been a while since I actually seen a countdown timer on a website, but PCI just decided to put one on, which is awesome. So it's the final countdown with the band Europe behind, if anybody gets that. So this is SSL early TLS. This is another forward-dated one. This isn't one that's in place now, but they push the date a couple of times. Coming down to the wire here, June 30th is the last date you can use SSL early TLS. What that means is TLS 1.1 or greater need to be in place, 1.0 or less, including SSL, need to be disabled as an accepted protocol with that. Right now, to be compliant, you need to have a documented risk mitigation and migration plan, still use an SSL early TLS with this. If you're a service provider, just make sure that you have TLS 1.1.1.2 already enabled. That's our previous requirement. One of the things I big time recommend to clients is before you pull the trigger on this, understand what the impact is, especially if it's consumer facing. So when I was actually at previously with an e-commerce environment and we were evaluating this control on disabling TLS 1.0, we already disabled SSL a little bit ago, but TLS 1.0, we actually evaluated based on who was negotiating to our site and the revenue that we're getting over the site, and it was a little over $5 million for us disabling TLS 1.0 that we would actually no longer be pulling in through our site with it. So important to understand, especially if you're consumer facing, because you don't control those endpoints, what would be the true impact before actually pulling on that trigger with that. One last thing, which I just find humorous, is that PCI has exempted all the point of sale devices out there as long as, quote, they can be verified as not being susceptible to any known exploits for SSL or early TLS, which is funny because if there are no exploits for SSL early TLS, then why are websites affected by them as well? But point of sale devices, as long as they don't have any quote unquote vulnerabilities with that, they get a pass on it. And that is it. So if we have some questions, I think.
Yeah, we sure do. We'll, if you want to continue asking your questions, I'll go through the ones that we've gotten so far. First is, why would responding to the failure of security controls be a service provider only? Why wouldn't that just be for merchants as well?
Yeah, so so here's I'm talking on the mindset of the PCI Council and some of that stuff. They look at service providers as being a more risky endeavor from, a compromise of cardholder data, because they are handling multiple merchant accounts. So multiple merchants are funneling through cardholder data, or they would have access to cardholder data through, many of merchants with that. So they wanted to add more controls on top of that, because they feel like if they get compromised, many merchants would actually be impacted to that than just one merchant being impacted to that. Obviously, that's plus and minus. If you're a small service provider that has 3 PCI clients, you might not even be touching or seeing, 100,000 transactions where, there's many merchants that are way bigger than that, type of thing. So, but that's kind of the perspective of PCI. So they want to enforce added controls on top of that just for that environment. Keep in mind too, and this is kind of a forward dated thing, I believe, and hearing through some rumor mills and everything, that the service providers are kind of a test bed for merchants. So the controls that you see nowadays being tested may kind of slip into applying to everybody at some point. So when you're going through your PCI compliance, just kind of take a look at that and seeing, as you're doing future planning, whether, certain controls might be good to incorporate in a later date so that you're not scrambling. And, PCI will always forward date controls to, a year or two out, if it's a new big change. But just keep that in mind too.
We have one, going back to defining what a significant change is.
Yep.
The goal, of course, is to exclude. What can you exclude and what can't you? Like, if we're trying to exclude as much as we can, how would, is there some better way to justify that or not?
Yeah, I mean, I would define it as, kind of a scoping change and how much, impact it is. It's hard to say for every client. I just know that, some of the PCI ask or examples that they give, there are certain environments that would be just crazy to define as a significant change. I brought up the web server. They give that as an example as a potential significant change is standing up a web server. But, into today of auto scaling and everything like that, that just doesn't make any sense of why that would be a significant change to the environment. So it's hard to answer on a broad scale, but look at, how much changes are going into the environment. If you're replicating something that's already existing in the environment, that's already been covered under your vulnerability scans, your penetration testing, that you're not introducing a significant risk or exposure change, then I wouldn't count that as a significant change. Now, if you're doing a brand new application, new SAP rollout or PeopleSoft, or, just standing up a new offering or service line, that, in my opinion, could be definitely a significant change in that.
We have a couple of questions on TLS 1.0. Is that still needed for Exchange 2010 and up?
For what?
Is TLS 1.0 still needed for Exchange 2010 and up?
I'm not totally aware of that one. I believe you can configure TLS 1.2 for Exchange. It might not come out of the box default, but I'm not aware of it being required for that. I don't know why it would be for external negotiation. Now, keep in mind, older, and this would be another question here, older mail servers could, if you're not supporting them and all they can negotiate at is 1.0, you might be not getting some emails coming inbound or having them being encrypted at all. But I would put also out there, if you have your email server in scope, I would question that as well, because while you can have your email server in scope, but there's large questions of whether it's encrypted. You have to do added encryption on cardholder data coming across email. You have to encrypt at rest, which typically email servers are not encrypted at rest. So I would almost question not even having email in scope for that. So, and try and de-scope that out.
The second one is, so if I'm pulling in $5 million via TLS 1.0, won't I fail the audit come July? What should I do?
Yes.
Will fail.
Yeah.
What could I do to get around that?
Yeah. So, and this is definitely going to be interesting, and something to watch out as kind of that deadline goes past. If you're doing significant, significant revenue, I mean, even just pointing at Google and all their infrastructure, they haven't disabled TLS 1.0 yet. Because I mean, when you're talking about large volumes of people coming in and axing a old, protocol that everybody on their, Windows 7, IE 8, is supporting with that, yeah, you could affect large populations with that. What I think, and this is going to be a question, we already got the question on, can you do a compensating control around doing TLS 1.0? As of right now, we have not found a good one. Researching it, it's a weakness in the protocol itself. And unless you're wrapping it in and around another protocol, which if you can do that anyways, why wouldn't you just, upgrade the protocol, standard there. There's no direct compensating control to that. What I do suspect would happen if you are in that boat, that you have a large portion of people that, it's a significant impact or revenue cost to that, there may be some negotiations back up to the bank where they say, we're pulling in this, and in my opinion, the risk is so negligible, it's almost crazy, that they're enforcing this right now. Just that you have to be right there in transit of each one of the consumers, or at their data center to try and decrypt. And if you're already there, you're already next to all the data. That there'll probably be some conversation saying, we can't make this, what can you do for us? And they may give some passes. I can't speak for some of the banks out there, but if there's significant impact and the banks, if they're not getting their revenue off, some of the interchange costs and everything like that, they might say, yeah, that doesn't mean a lot to us, and might give them a pass if they get a letter, because they are responsible for the merchant's compliance with that. So we'll wait and see how it shakes out, but I'm expecting if you're big enough and have a big enough impact, banks will bend a little on that.
Couple on multi-factor and two-factor authentication.
Yep.
8.3.1. For a cloud model, at what points can multi-factor access be implemented, i.e. Infrastructure as a service, cloud model?
Yep. Yeah. So there's a number of ways you can actually implement it. We're actually working with a vendor right now on doing something similar to this. But essentially, it comes around the CDE. Keep in mind that when you're doing a service provider along that lines, pretty much your systems that you attest to aren't usually considered part of the CDE. So you might spin up, a VM or some type of infrastructure for the client, but at that point there, they usually leave that to the customer itself. So if you spin up a Windows box or a Linux box and you're connecting via SSH or something along that lines, you're responsible for supplying two-factor authentication along that lines. And like we said before, it's CDE administrative access. So if you're spinning up an IaaS, type environment, once it's spun up, it's all the customer's responsibility onto there. Now, from the customer side, if they're utilizing a service provider, like an AWS, or something along that lines, typically there are ways of intermixing like SSH keys and user credentials to provide that two-factor access, or integrating tokens or push type services like Google Authenticator or Duo Security or something along that. So there are options out there, but from the cloud service provider, they don't really do the two-factor on that because they're not directly handling cardholder data on their systems that they're espousing to.
And the second one is two-factor authentication on network appliances such as firewalls and switches.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have to do that, or how would you do that?
So if the firewall or network appliance ever touches cardholder data in clear text, so if it's an unencrypted transmission across the network, which as PCI has it, you're not required to transmit cardholder data encrypted across a trusted network. You have to encrypt passwords. Passwords can never be in the clear transmission or stored, but cardholder data you can actually transmit in the clear internally with that. And if it's going across network appliances, it is counted as CDE. Any device that stores, processes, or transmits cardholder data would be included in that. So what I typically recommend for that is one of the more common examples, as we mentioned, is putting an administrative choke point in, jump boxes, things of that nature, that would restrict it that you would have to hop onto a dedicated Linux or Windows box and then hop into the administration of those network appliances. Or you could also integrate, if you're integrating through like an AD type interface, you could also incorporate two-factor access as kind of working that through. So where you'd have to type in a password and a 6-digit PIN on the end of your password. I've seen solutions as that as well through like TACX or something like that. So there's options. It really comes down to, your environment, your impact, and, what you think would be less impactful. One of the things I also would bring up, if you're doing administrative choke points, think about failover. So the worst thing that would happen if you can't get to, you know, a core device, somebody screwed up an ACL, now blocking everything. If you only, or, you know, you have one jump box and an administrator screwed up and now that's down, now you can't administer your entire environment. Think about fallback, you know, with this and what your fallback procedures are if critical components are not available. So,
from a merchant perspective, what trends are you seeing in cryptographic tools or architectures? Anything changing? You said that was for service providers only.
Yeah, I mean, and that's just documenting it. I mean, we see a lot more merchants pushing off a lot of the processing. So, I mean, it's not new, but tokenization, like everybody wants to kind of descope the, you know, get rid of it, you know, transfer all the kind of PCI responsibility risk to another, you know, core service provider with that. So as the awareness of PCI goes up and how much it might be a pain to actually comply with it, especially if you have a small processing environment. We've seen a kind of a more of a shift, you know, as years go by that, you know, they're going to a, you know, dedicated payment gateway to not only tokenize, and then they can do all the processing, refunds, everything off that token, and just kind of ship that over it, or do like small providers, like, you know, if you're doing card present, you know, the explosion of like Square or, you know, some of the dedicated devices. And actually Square says they're a payment facilitator model where they kind of sub merchant account, their merchant account, and you're basically extension on their merchant account. So they're responsible for your PCI compliance, and they even say on their website that, you know, you don't have to do anything for PCI as long as you just do their stuff. So if you're avoiding PCI and they have, you know, that model, which they're allowed to do, you know, and it helps that they have a majority shareholding of Visa, you know, and that's a little bit of favoritism, but yeah, so there are models out there that, you know, kind of help with the PCI compliance realm with that. But the card brands have been pushing hard on getting more levels in that. Visa did a mandate a few years ago that they wanted every level 4, which is the smallest merchant, you know, from 0 to 100 or 0 to 20 in the e-commerce realm, type merchants on transactions per year. They wanted everybody attesting. Now, that hasn't shaken out as, you know, as they kind of dictated with that. But they have, personally for us, we've seen a lot of level 3s coming to us, getting first-time letters saying you must now, you know, attest to PCI and submit an SAQ. And some of them are very big companies along this line. So definitely getting some more traction there with them. So.
What about the multi or twice a year penetration testing?
Yep.
Just we here at TrustedSec haven't seen that yet. There's a huge demand from customers. How are our organizations going about that? Are they doing some on their own, or what's the? Yeah,
so PCI clarified a little bit, like you didn't have to have 2 starting on February 1st, you know, where the requirement was, you know, February 1st, you now have to start doing 2. Basically, your next one it should be within the next 6 months. And then it will be 6 months after that if you're testing segmentation controls being a service provider type of thing. So yeah, we wouldn't see a lot of that right now, but you know, starting within the next 6 months will be the first one, and then 6 months thereafter they should be testing on that cycle there. And for PCI pen tests, just a kind reminder, PCI does not have to test within the cardholder data environment. It has to test scoping against the cardholder data environment and the supportive systems in the cardholder data environment. So that's the scope. And the PCI is very clear. If they don't get into your cardholder data environment, it doesn't matter. It still can be a successful pen test as long as you go from each of the scopes that they're segmenting off the out-of-scope networks. So if you have a wireless network that's connected into your CDE and you have a corporate network connected into your CDE, still ACL'd off, there should be pen tests going in each of those networks, you know, to make sure that segmentation controls are in place with them.
And that leads into the last one that we have here, segmentation. Can you talk a little bit about other solutions that you're seeing as it's getting more popular?
Yep.
MAC, you know, some of the multi-location segmentation type of thing.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, still the most common today is obviously the traditional ACL, network ACLs to kind of segment off, you know, a large swath of, you know, devices with that. So, and I don't think that's going away anytime soon. but we do have customers, especially in large environments, looking to actually push a lot of the segmentation down to the endpoints. We have even one large customer, they're a regional bank, and they have a lot of people interacting with card data because of all the services they do. And they were actually looking to push out not kind of a let's segment only our card data, but actually a segment off everything that's not in there, which would just, so this network doesn't need to be in there, or these group of people don't need to have card data, and we're just going to segment that off. And they've been implementing a NAC-based solution based on profiles of users and then deploying that out. So that's definitely a creative way, and absolutely with that. PCI gives as good as guidance as they can give with that. And usually the best guidance, they have a scoping segmentation, which is very interesting from a read point, but most of the stuff that we rely on is right at the top of PCI DSS. And it has ideal scoping for all that, and says, what's considered in scoping, what's considered out of scope, for this, examples of different devices in that. We did a blog post last year, I think, on proper segmentation at the fall, so definitely look that up from TrustedSec on different considerations from a segmentation. The one nice thing the guidance document did do, it expanded a little bit in and around other components that could be due. So they mentioned endpoints and ACLs on, different host-based type products, or HIPs, could be used as a segmentation part. So there are definitely a lot of solutions. If you're going down a new route, I definitely recommend getting a QSA in the room, and while you're kind of designing that, to talk with them to see what would be, good, bad, and also if you have a good QSA, they should also point out gray areas, because I bring up with clients all the time, I might not be their QSA forever. And they should know that if there's a gray area where if you get a new QSA in, that they might not be okay with that, they should know those risks as well. So we try and make that pointed, to all of our clients to say, you're going down this route, I accept it, but maybe other QSAs wouldn't, type of thing. So.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, thank you very much. It looks like that's the last question we have outside of will this webinar be posted? Yes, we'll have a posted webinar. As well, if you look in the chat box, we also have a couple of blogs on how to choose a QSA, as well as more information on these controls that Justin went over and explained. And then we'll also be sending out a follow-up email along with that as well. And as always, feel free to call or write anytime if there's anything else we can do, or if you have any further questions for Justin or would like us to jump on a call with you. Check us out on LinkedIn and Twitter. Have a lot of following there, so a lot going on. And basically that's about it. So thank you, Justin, for all your information, and really appreciate everyone joining today.
Thanks, everyone.
Yep, thank you so much.